And also a very warm welcome from me for this third seminar in this term and in this series, this mini-series we've had on religion, Christianity in development. So if you remember, we had Dr. Romina Estrati talk to us about Ethiopian Orthodoxy and domestic violence. I gave a paper last time because somebody couldn't make it on the sort of longer history of Christianity development. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have Dr. Richard Burgess with us today, who's going to present very fresh research to us on Nigerian Pentecostals in development. And I think this is extremely significant because Dr. Burgess will talk about the perhaps most overstudied church in the world, and not just them, but they're certainly part of this research of the Redeemed Christian Church of God. And yet, for many, many years, people haven't really been looking at the charitable actions that Pentecostals have been taking. And this is not just to emphasize how whatever good things Pentecostals are doing in the world, but there's of course a lot of politics and questions emerging from this as well that needs proper research. And Dr. Burgess is a forerunner in this very field. I've known him for a very long time. He's currently senior lecturer in Roehampton, but I've got to know him as a foremost Nigerian Pentecostalism expert. So he's written his PhD on Nigerian Pentecostal history, especially in Igbo land and the time of the Civil War. And I still consider him as one of my go-to source when I want to understand something about Nigerian Pentecostalism. He spent 16 years, Richard, in Nigeria teaching theology.
Stretching over 16 years, yes.
Stretching over 16 years, yeah. And then I think, met in the context of a research project on Nigerian Pentecostals in Europe, which was one of the first projects that we initiated from the European Research Network on Global Pentecostalism. And he has been at Roehampton for the last 7 years, now senior lecturer, and I'm really excited to hear your presentation today about Nigerian Pentecostals. So the floor is yours. And as I was said before, if you'd like to mute yourself until the end of the session, and then we will have time for questions and answers. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Jörg, and thank you for inviting me to present. I want to share a PowerPoint, so I'll share the screen now. I hope you can see that. So in this paper, I'm going to talk about my recently published book. As the title suggests, it examines the role of Nigerian Pentecostalism in development. And it brings together two vibrant research areas, Pentecostal studies and the field of religion and development. I begin the paper by introducing the book, and secondly, I discuss the field of religion and development and sketch the contours of Nigerian Pentecostalism. I then give a brief overview of the book before focusing particularly on 3 of the chapters. In Africa, Pentecostalism is fast becoming the dominant expression of Christianity, contributing to the shift in Christianity's center of gravity southwards. As a religious tradition, Pentecostalism emphasizes the experience of the Spirit and the practice of charismatic gifts such as healing, prophecy, and speaking in tongues. One of the aims of the book is to elucidate the nature and significance of Nigerian Pentecostal development activities. Another aim is to investigate the contextual and cultural factors that shape the way that Nigerian Pentecostals understand development and engage in development activities. The research on which the book is based is primarily qualitative in nature. The main locations of my research are the cities of Lagos, Abuja, and Jos in Nigeria, and London in the UK. And during fieldwork, I interviewed Pentecostal pastors, political aspirants, educators, social activists, and leaders of a variety of development ministries and NGOs. And I also engaged in participant observation of Pentecostal church meetings, conferences, and development initiatives. Given the widespread use of the media by Nigerian Pentecostals, data from interviews and observations was supplemented by the collection of print and electronic media products. And church websites proved an invaluable source of information, providing insight into the church's self-understanding, theological beliefs, organizational structure, and development activities. Recently, there's been a growing research interest in studying the relationship between development and religion. The academic discipline of development studies was originally founded on the belief that religion is not important to development. It was assumed that as societies developed and modernized, they would undergo a process of secularization. However, three trends explain the turn to religion in development studies. And these are the rise of political Islam, the continuing salience of religion in people's lives, associated especially with the growth of Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity in developing countries, and the recognition of the importance of non-government organizations, including religious organizations, as mechanisms for delivering development. And it's now increasingly recognized that religion plays a significant role in relation to development outcomes, whether for good or for ill. Taking its cue from the post-2015 International Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which have a range of foci, the book examines Pentecostal development practices broadly in relation to the intersecting spheres of economics, governance and democracy, human rights, healthcare, education, peace building, and migration. The Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, are part of a broad agenda that includes environmental, social, and economic development, as well as food security and gender equality. In contrast to the MDGs, which focused on meeting the basic needs of the poorest countries, the SDGs represent a global agenda for sustainable development that encompasses both developing and developed countries. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation, with a population of over 200 million people. The country is more or less equally divided between Christians and Muslims. The three main ethnic groups, the northern Hausa Fulani are predominantly Muslim, the eastern Igbo are predominantly Christian, and the western Yoruba are divided between the two faiths. Nigerian Pentecostal churches are of interest for a number of reasons. First, the Pentecostal landscape in Nigeria is perhaps the most dynamic in the whole of Africa, often with a significant missionary impulse and exercising theological influence on other African Christians. Nigeria currently hosts some of the largest churches in the world. One of the churches that features prominently in the book is the Redeemed Christian Church of God, which has over 14,000 branches in Nigeria and branches in 197 nations. Secondly, Nigerian Pentecostal churches are increasingly assuming more prominent roles as they seek to address the social and moral ills of contemporary society. Thirdly, there's a fierce competition with Islam for dominance in Nigerian public space. Thus, the interreligious factor is important. And finally, Nigerian Pentecostal communities are often transnational in nature, with aspirations to build multicultural congregations around the globe. Nigerian Pentecostals have come in for some bad press in recent years. They've been linked to financial misconduct and human rights infringements against women and children. Criticism has also been leveled against certain pastors who purchased private jets despite the relative poverty of the majority of their members. However, the main thesis of my book is that there is an emerging sector within Nigerian Pentecostalism, which is becoming increasingly active in development initiatives geared towards poverty alleviation and human well-being. And this shift in orientation is driven by a variety of theological, sociological and contextual factors, including Pentecostalism's encounter with Islam. So here's a brief outline of the book. Following an introduction, Chapter 1 examines the role of faith-based organizations in development, with a particular focus on the Nigerian context. And here I introduce some of the Pentecostal ministries and NGOs that feature in the book, before discussing key characteristics of Nigerian Pentecostal churches that shape their understanding of development and their development activities. Chapters 2 to 8 address one of the topics included in the SDGs. The Chapter 2 examines Pentecostal engagement with the economic domain, with a particular focus on the prosperity gospel and initiatives geared towards economic empowerment and capacity building, including programs directed at women entrepreneurs and Nigerians in the diaspora. Chapter 3 discusses the intersection between Pentecostals and politics in Nigeria and some of the factors influencing Pentecostal political behavior. It examines various political strategies employed by Nigerian Pentecostals, ranging from electoral politics and political protest to more implicit strategies such as prophecy and prayer. The following 2 chapters focus on areas that have long been associated with faith-based development practice in Africa, education and healthcare. Chapter 4 examines Pentecostal educational initiatives and their contribution to development. The Nigerian Pentecostals are responding to the perceived collapse of morality and declining standards in Nigeria's educational system by engaging in capacity building programs in public schools, establishing educational NGOs, and opening private schools and universities. Chapter 5 investigates Pentecostal approaches to healing and healthcare, paying particular attention to the influence of theology, culture, and context on Pentecostal health-seeking practices. It also explores Pentecostal responses to some of the major health challenges in Nigeria. The next 2 chapters address human rights issues that feature prominently in the SDGs. Chapter 6 examines Pentecostal responses to human rights infringements against women, young people, and children. And here I examine some of the Pentecostal ministries and NGOs addressing the needs of street children, commercial sex workers, and trafficking victims. And Chapter 7 considers Pentecostalism's development role in relation to ethno-religious violence, conflict resolution, and peace building. And finally, Chapter 8 investigates the nexus between Nigerian Pentecostalism, migration, and development, with a particular focus on Britain and the United States. The book is completed by a conclusion which examines various factors that account for the plurality of African Pentecostal approaches to development and discusses some of the implications of the engagement between African Pentecostalism and the development sector. I now want to look at the first of 3 chapters in a little bit more detail. So Chapter 5 examines Pentecostal approaches to healing and healthcare. Healthcare is a key component of the Sustainable Development Agenda. The SDGs include one specific goal for health with 13 targets, SDG 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. The popularity of the Pentecostal practice of divine healing in Nigeria stems from its resonance with African traditional worldviews and the context of poverty in communities where access to affordable healthcare is restricted. Pentecostal pastors with gifts of healing attract large followings. Increasingly, however, Nigerian Pentecostals are embracing a holistic model of healing that combines beliefs in divine healing with the use of modern medicine. And they're also engaged in healthcare interventions in the wider community. The chapter begins by surveying the academic field of religion and health. Secondly, it sketches the landscape of health in Nigeria. Thirdly, the chapter examines the health beliefs and practices of Nigerian Pentecostals and discusses both the strengths and weaknesses of Pentecostal approaches to healing and healthcare. And finally, it explores Pentecostal responses to three major health challenges: HIV/AIDS, maternal and reproductive health, and disability. As a field, public health addresses health-related issues at the level of community and populations rather than individuals. Linda Barnes identifies three broad trends which tend to surface in relation to public health and religion. The first suggests that religious observance may pose health risks. The second argues that religious traditions may impede the growth of modernity. And the third targets religious convictions that may obstruct the implementation of biomedical healthcare delivery. As Barnes notes, in each, a common feature is the tendency to view religion as a problem. Rather than employing a deficit approach to health, which focuses on what is lacking in particular contexts, recent research on religion and public health adopts an assets-based approach, which explores the health assets of faith communities and their role in reaching and changing behavior of hard-to-reach groups. A recent WHO analysis of the world's health systems ranked Nigeria 187th out of 191 member states in terms of health system efficiency. Nigerian Pentecostal churches possess a variety of tangible health assets such as human capital, financial resources, and buildings, as well as less tangible assets such as religious beliefs, values, and practices that encourage good health habits and motivate compassionate care towards others. However, the enchanted worldview that underpins Nigerian Pentecostal approaches to illness and healing sometimes results in antipathy towards medical technology and recourse to rituals and behaviors that are detrimental to public health. For example, sufferers of mental health conditions and HIV/AIDS are vulnerable to stigmatization and accusations of witchcraft, which can lead to abusive practices and human rights violations. Nigerian Pentecostals trace the etiology of disease to three main sources. Firstly, sickness is perceived as a product of a fallen and sinful world. Secondly, sickness is traced to supernatural agents such as Satan, evil spirits, and witches. And thirdly, some Nigerian Pentecostals refer to biological and environmental causes of ill health. But these etiologies of ill health are not discrete categories, but often overlap. For example, the Redeemed Christian Church of God's reproductive and family health policy includes the following statement: health connotes wholeness of a person's body, mind, and spirit, integrated and coordinated, and able to function creatively within the community. Disease is everything that makes us less human and diminishes the image of God in us. It comes from the devil, sin, ignorance, poverty, and poor nutrition, and is to be combated with every means that God has given us. In the book, I examine various therapeutic strategies adopted by Nigerian Pentecostals to combat ill health. Most churches provide contexts for participants to receive prayer for healing. For example, the week-long Holy Ghost Congress organized by the Redeemed Christian Church of God attracts several million people, largely due to the expectation of miracles associated with the ministry of Pastor Enoch Adeboye. And when I attended in 2010, Adeboye frequently interrupted his sermon with divine revelations regarding miraculous healings taking place in the auditorium. The religious health assets of Nigerian Pentecostal churches include initiatives geared towards addressing health inequalities and obstacles to accessing health services. Arise Women is a faith-based NGO founded by Pastor Siju Iloyamade, which delivers free medical care to grassroots community in Lagos via mobile clinics. It also aims to improve women's health through health promotion, education, and advocacy. and organizes an annual health walk called Arise Walk for Life to promote healthy living. Pentecostal hospitals offering subsidized health services are a growing phenomenon, mirroring the hospitals and clinics set up by Christian missions in pre-independence Nigeria. These are usually established by megachurches which have the necessary financial and human resources for such ventures. For example, RCCG's City of David parish in Lagos owns a hospital called Healing Stripes Hospital, whose stated aim is to provide affordable healthcare. And Fountain of Life Church, again in Lagos, runs Grace Springs Medical Center with a mission to demonstrate the love of Jesus through the provision of quality healthcare. Now here I depart from the book and consider Pentecostal responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Pentecostal churches have responded to the pandemic in various ways. Many churches complied with government directives to curb the virus by moving their church services online. However, others initially resisted the ban on religious gatherings, claiming divine protection for committed followers of Jesus and divine healing for those who succumbed to the virus. Some churches have donated medical equipment to government hospitals and food to local communities suffering the effects of the pandemic. Pastors such as the Redeemed Christian Church of God's Enoch Adeboye have canvassed prayers on behalf of health workers and for the pandemic to be lifted. Adeboye believes that the crisis is God's way of calling the world to godly living, irrespective of class or social standing, and to show that God is in control of human affairs. Significantly, Adeboye has also criticized some of his fellow pastors for prophesying that the pandemic will be over in a few months. He himself predicted that the pandemic would subside but would not disappear. And RCCG has broadcasted public health messages and educational programs for children whose schools were closed during the lockdown. However, some churches have broadcast potentially damaging or harmful statements. For example, that the virus is linked to the rollout of 5G phone networks, and echoing Donald Trump that the anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine was a cure for the virus. And this is a statement by Pastor Sam Adeyemi, who leads Daystar Christian Center in Lagos. At Daystar, we believe in serving our communities. As the lockdown subsists, many people are going through challenging times and need our help. That is why we're distributing food to the vulnerable through our cell fellowship network. We're also helping to protect our healthcare officials by donating protective equipment. We've been called to charity at such a time as this, and we've responded to the call. So far, our government has risen impressively to the occasion. However, it's obvious that this is not a task for the government alone. Compassionate institutions must also take responsibility for the welfare of our nation in these trying times. Here I move on to chapter 7, entitled Pentecostals, Violence and Peace Building. And in this chapter, I begin with the following cameo. In September 2001, I experienced firsthand a violent clash between Muslims and Christians while teaching in the northern city of Jos. For 10 days until the army intervened, staff and students were confined to the college campus while Muslim and Christian mobs rampaged across the city. As a deterrent to would-be attackers, students armed with machetes took turns to patrol the campus perimeter. Days and nights were disturbed by the sound of intermittent gunfire, and from the vantage point of a hill overlooking the city, we could see smoke rising from multiple locations. A few students ventured out into the neighboring community, returning with reports of dead bodies on the streets and buildings destroyed. The crisis began 4 days before the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States, but received little international media coverage despite extensive loss of life and destruction of property. Unfortunately, similar scenes repeated themselves at least 4 more times over the next 10 years. In 2015, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies became Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the first target of SDG 16 calls for a significant reduction in all forms of violence and related deaths everywhere. In northern Nigeria, Islamic resurgence combined with the growth of Pentecostal charismatic Christianity have exacerbated existing religious tensions, resulting in escalating levels of violence and hindering development. Successive waves of violence have had a devastating effect on development in terms of the loss of lives, forced migration, and the destruction of property. Studies of Pentecostalism in Nigeria have suggested that the venture of Pentecostals into the public arenas of politics and media to combat Islamization, combined with their emphasis on evangelism and spiritual warfare, have increased tensions between Christians and Muslims. And this has led in turn to protests and retaliation by Muslim groups. What is sometimes overlooked, however, is the capacity of Pentecostal Christianity to play a constructive role in building peace and addressing the social needs of victims of violence. And Pentecostal responses to ethno-religious violence include interfaith dialogue, peace-building initiatives, and programs that engage Christian and Muslim young people. Pentecostals are also involved in development projects that cater to both Christian and Muslim victims of violence. And one example that I write about in the book is the Young Ambassadors for Community Peace and Interfaith Foundation, founded by Assemblies of God pastor Yakubu Pam in Jos. In December 2009, Pam gathered a group of Muslim youth who lived near his church to discuss peace principles. His efforts were put to the test in January 2010, when a major crisis broke out between Christians and Muslims in Jos. Significantly, some of the Muslim men he had trained protected his church when other Muslim youth from outside the area tried to destroy it. Since then, Pam has organized a series of community-wide peace rallies involving Christian and Muslim youth. He's also opened a center in a neutral area of Jos where both Christians and Muslims can meet together to watch peace films, develop friendships, build conflict resolution and leadership skills, and plan peace programs in their respective areas. Through this foundation, some of the leading perpetrators of the violence have now become advocates of peace and reconciliation. Significantly, the foundation does not seek to convert Muslims who participate in its programs. In fact, it's crucial for its approach to peace building that Muslim peace ambassadors remain engaged with their religious communities, which would be difficult if they converted to Christianity. Reverend Pam claims that the strategy of engaging the youth as peace ambassadors has succeeded in reducing levels of ethno-religious violence in Jos, though his optimism is tempered by concerns over the threat posed by the Boko Haram insurgency. Here again, I depart from the book, but I stay on the topic of Pentecostal responses to violence. And if you followed the news and social media recently, you'll have seen that Tuesday, the 20th of October, was a black day in Nigeria's history, when unarmed protesters in Lagos were gunned down by the Nigerian military with multiple fatalities. Nationwide protests against police brutality began on October the 8th, after a video emerged showing police officers from the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS, allegedly shooting and killing a young man in Nigeria's Delta State. SARS was created in 1984 in response to the epidemic of violent crime in the country. It later evolved into the same problem it was designed to stop, a criminal enterprise that acts with impunity. The peaceful protests initially called for the disbanding of SARS, but soon morphed into a wider call for police reform and better governance. The protests were mainly driven by young people and fueled by outspoken members of the Nigerian diaspora. Social media, especially Twitter, played a crucial role in publicizing the movement around the world and maintaining its momentum. Some Pentecostal pastors joined the End SARS street protests. A notable example was Pastor Enoch Adeboy in the picture at the bottom, who's generally regarded as the most influential and respected church leader in Nigeria. Other Nigerian pastors who lead large churches spoke out on social media in support of the protests, condemned the violence perpetrated by the Nigerian police and the military. And one example was Sam Ademi, senior pastor of Daystar Christian Center in Lagos. Pastors have also called for prayer for the nation on behalf of those affected by the violence. Significantly, on social media, there were widespread calls for the Vice President of Nigeria, Yemi Osinbajo, who's a pastor in the Redeemed Christian Church of God, to resign. And in Britain, Pastor Agu Erukwu, who's head of RCCG UK and the Pentecostal president of Churches Together in England, released a video condemning the violence and urging Nigerians to join End SARS protests in London. And here's an excerpt from this video. The targeted killing of unarmed protesters who are exercising their constitutional right to protest is reprehensible. We urge the Church and the UK authorities to condemn the actions of the Nigerian government and call for an end to the violent crackdown against the protesters. The Church must speak out for justice and truth and challenge injustice in the world. But let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream, Amos 5:24. We recommend those who sadly lost their lives and pray comfort for their families and communities. We pray healing for those who've been wounded and those who've been traumatized by recent events. We pray for a restoration of peace in the nation. The final chapter I want to look at is chapter 8, entitled Pentecostals, Migration and Development. And this chapter investigates the intersection between Nigerian Pentecostalism, migration and development, with a particular focus on Britain and the United States, where some of the largest Nigerian diaspora communities are located. The chapter begins by discussing the relationship between migration and development. Although it's not referred to as a distinct domain, there are 7 migration-related references in the SDGs, and these include education, modern-day slavery, migrant worker rights, safe migration, migrant remittances, and the trafficking of children. The chapter then reviews recent literature on immigrant religion and civic engagement. The remainder of the chapter investigates the contributions of Nigerian Pentecostal diaspora churches to immigrant incorporation, civic engagement, and international development. Thomas Feist refers to migrants as transnational development actors who form social spaces such as transnational families, hometown associations, and cross-border religious congregations. And the Pentecostal churches discussed in this chapter fit the profile of Feist's transnational development actors. Their development activities are shaped by ongoing connections between home and host societies, facilitated by modern communication, information technology, and ease of travel. Migrants are increasingly regarded as vital agents of development by financial institutions such as the World Bank, international organizations from the United Nations, and NGOs. However, in Europe and the United States, migrants are among the most vulnerable to poverty-related problems, such as social exclusion, homelessness, and food insecurity. The chapter examines a range of initiatives in Britain and the United States that address social issues such as homelessness, food insecurity, and knife crime. It also considers the contribution of diaspora churches to international development through individual and collective remittances, short-term mission trips, and development projects. Some Nigerian congregations are involved in a wide spectrum of social engagement activities. Many, however, are minimally engaged, either due to a particular theological orientation that favors evangelism over social action, or because they lack the necessary human and material resources. And one congregation that I discuss in the chapter is RCCG's Jesus House London. Jesus House has a membership of around 3,000 and is heavily involved in social action. Its social arm is called Church Social Responsibility, which consists of two strands: community action, which is the local expression of the church's social responsibility, and CSR International, which is the international expression. Community action initiatives include the Novo Centre, which is a drop-in centre for residents of a local housing estate, Jesus House Prison Ministry, Colindale Food Bank, Abigail's Court, which is an outreach to the elderly, a Christians Against Poverty Debt Counselling Centre, and a Christmas homeless shelter. CSR International addresses problems associated with poverty, injustice, and conflict, and has collaborated with local churches and NGOs to fund projects in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. It also sends teams to visit and assist some of these projects. Social engagement has enabled the church to gain public recognition, resulting in a number of high-profile visits from politicians and royalty, the most famous being those of the visit of the Prince of Wales in 2007 and of Theresa May immediately prior to the 2017 general election. So in conclusion, Nigerian Pentecostalism's contribution to successful development outcomes is difficult to determine. There is a plurality of Pentecostal approaches to development. Various factors account for the differences in the nature and scope of African Pentecostal development activities, which I discuss in the concluding chapter. And these include theological orientation, organizational culture and styles of leadership, and the size and socioeconomic status of Pentecostal organizations. Most of the churches and NGOs discussed in the book represent only one strand of Nigerian Pentecostalism, albeit a growing and increasingly influential one. In Nigeria, these churches are clearly having an impact at the local level through their economic empowerment programs, their healthcare initiatives, their educational institutions and NGOs, their rehabilitation programs, and peace-building initiatives. At the national level, the movement is having less visible impact despite its evident growth and the ambitions of its leaders. Much will depend on whether its influence is able to spread to other sectors of the movement. Another factor is the interreligious dimension and the disruptive influence of Christian-Muslim conflict. In Britain, Nigerian Pentecostal churches are gradually becoming a social force to be reckoned with. They are expanding, finding new ways of engaging with society, and are shaping the self-conception of their members as valuable members of their host society. They represent a challenge to the notion that religion is losing its significance in public life. Nonetheless, despite their cosmopolitan agenda, they've generally failed to make incursions into the indigenous population and remain predominantly Nigerian in composition. And they're also facing a critical moment in their history in terms of retaining second and third generation African members brought up in Britain. Thank you.